never thought I'd end up like this. 64 years old, living on a farm that's more prison paradise, with a husband who's become a stranger. How did we get here, Howard and I? I remember when we first bought this place. We were so young, so full of dreams. Howard would wrap his arms around me, point to the rolling hills, and say, "One day, Charlotte, this'll all be ours." And it is now, I suppose, but at what cost? These days, I spend most of my time alone. The creaking of the old farmhouse and the distant lowing of cattle are my only companions. Howard's always in the city, chasing that next big deal or whatever it is financial consultants do. When he does come home, it's like living with a ghost. Last month, he stayed for a week, 7 whole days, and we barely exchanged more than a few sentences. "Did you pay the electric bill? When are they coming to service the tractor? It's all so cold." Practical. Where's the man who used to surprise me with wildflowers from the meadow? Who danced with me in the kitchen, even when there was no music playing? I try to keep busy. There's always work to be done on a farm, after all. But in the quiet moments, when the day's chores are done and I'm left with nothing but my thoughts, that's when the loneliness really hits. I find myself staring at old photos, tracing the lines of our younger faces, wondering where those people went. Sometimes I think about reaching out to Howard, telling him how I feel, how desperately I need something, anything. A touch, a kind word, just some acknowledgement that I'm more than just a caretaker for this land. But every time I pick up the phone, I freeze. What would I even say? How do you tell someone you've known for decades that you feel like a stranger in your own marriage? The worst part is, I can't even remember when things changed. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a slow drift. Like watching the seasons change so gradual you hardly notice until one day you look up and realize summer's gone and winter's set in. When Josh pulled up in that old, beat-up truck, I wasn't expecting much more than an extra set of hands around the place. But almost immediately, something about him unsettled the routine I'd fallen into, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. Tall, broad-shouldered, yet with something boyish about him. He looked like a younger version of Howard, back when things felt alive. Josh's smile cracked through my cynicism like he had nothing weighing him down. He still saw the world as something full of possibilities. I'd forgotten what that looked like. I shouldn't have noticed, I tell myself, and yet I do. So the first day he jumps out of the truck and walks over to the porch, tipping his hat like some farm boy out of a movie, as if he didn't belong to the world of cell phones and screens. "You didn't have to come all this way," I hear myself saying, though the words feel hollow. Of course I needed him here. There's no denying that. The tractor's busted, fencing's falling apart, and I can't even lift half the things I used to. "You look like you could use some help," he says with an easy grin, and there's something in his tone and something considerate that Howard hasn't had for me in years. Josh gets to work fast. Fences get mended. The barn gets organized. He doesn't need to be told what to do. Watching him move across the yard under the late afternoon sun, his sweat-soaked shirt clinging to his back, a strange thought comes over me. So it's like all those years of dragging myself through the days have slipped off, and now I'm seeing everything more clearly. The warmth returns to a world that has been chilly for too long. I feel it in his glances too, the way his eyes linger when he thinks I'm not paying attention. At first, I brush it off. He's just being sweet, right? He's my nephew, after all. Yet, as the days go by, the air between us thickens in a way I'm not prepared for. Josh always offers to take on the harder tasks, insisting I rest, but when he speaks to me, it's like he sees me as more than this tired, middle-aged woman I've let myself become. It's been so damn long since anyone looked at me like that, appreciating me, not just someone taking up space. At night, after he turns in, I sit on the porch looking out over the fields. The evening bugs fill the silence with their incessant buzz, but my mind is even noisier. Every time I think of Josh, there's this mix of guilt and thrill I can't shake. I keep telling myself it's nothing, it's innocent, but something stirs inside me. A longing I thought had died years ago when Howard started fading away from me, little by little. Howard calls now and then, usually in the evenings when he's settled in some hotel room after working all day. He talks about his plans for retirement, what we need to do to the farm to increase its value, How long until we can close the books? Money, logistics, the same conversation over and over. Not once does he ask how I'm doing. If he ever did notice the loneliness in my voice, he never addressed it, not in any real way. His calls are like talking to a stranger. When he's home, it's not much better. He moves through the house as if he's there out of obligation, and each time we brush past each other, it reminds me of the touch that used to mean so much. Now, it's cold like a handshake from a business associate. His focus has shifted from us, to some future he's building, one where I'm more of a fixture around the house than an actual person. Be practical, Charlotte, he says, eyes on the bills we're too old for whatever you're thinking. I don't even know what he thinks I'm thinking. I can't point out how wrong things feel because that would mean acknowledging how checked out he really is. He's not cruel, not outright, but that's what makes it worse sometimes. He doesn't even care enough to fight with me anymore. And in the middle of all that, there's Josh. It was the little things at first, barely noticeable, almost innocent. The way his shirt clung to his chest when he bent down to lift a bale of hay, the way his arms flexed without effort. Strong, but not in an arrogant or showy way. Just strong because of who he was, because of the work. He didn't complain, didn't drag his feet. Josh was all energy, all life, like there was no task too menial or too heavy. I caught myself watching him more often than I cared to admit. I tried convincing myself it wasn't anything more than admiration, that I was just appreciating youth the way one admires a sturdy tree or a horse barreling down a field, something natural, something distant. But that was bullshit, wasn't it? Because I knew how empty the house felt whenever Howard left for his city meetings. And I knew how wrong it was that Josh's laughs, echoing through the quiet of the farm, filled that emptiness in a way Howard hadn't in years. He respected me, though. That's what really struck me. It wasn't just him being young and full of life. It was the way he saw me, listened. Not in the way Howard did, half absorbed, his mind always on some expense report or another deal. No, Josh cared. He noticed when I was too quiet, when my hands trembled as I gripped the shovel, trying to push through the arthritis that stiffened my fingers. He didn't make a big show of it, but he helped, and he made it feel like I was helping him, not the other way around. And then once in a while, his hand would find mine. Accidental, at first. A brush of fingers as he passed me a tool, or when our paths crossed too close in the tight spaces of the barn. Too subtle to be real, too electric not to be. Every single touch sent a warmth through me, sharp and fierce. I wasn't supposed to feel that way, not with Josh, but there it was. Unavoidable. Alive. That evening, the sun hung heavy as we both sat on the fence. It felt like any other day, yet the air had this weight to it, like something was waiting for us. We'd been talking for a long time. I don't even remember about what, maybe something about the crops or the weather, but the words lost meaning. Nothing felt important except how close we were. Our laughter felt strained, forced, almost like it was covering something simmering just beneath. And then it wasn't anymore. Josh leaned in before I even had the chance to process what was happening. His lips were soft but insistent, burning with a kind of need I hadn't felt from anyone in far too long. For a single, reckless moment, I wasn't 64 anymore. I wasn't the wife left behind while her husband chased money and more distance. I was just alive. I pulled away, but the space between us stayed charged, buzzing. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. So he was shaking his head, muttering apologies, words of guilt and explanation tumbling out of him. None of them reached me through the swell of emotions. My chest ached with the weight of both shame and longing. I should have put a stop to it right then. That's what anyone in their right mind would have done. But we didn't. The days following that kiss were like walking through a fog, where the line between wrong and right no longer made sense. Howard wasn't there to anchor me back to reality, to remind me where my loyalties should lie. Josh filled all the empty spaces. His eyes, his hands, everything carried this unbearable tension. It happened fast after that. We started to find ways to be alone, to steal seconds that built into minutes, leaning into that fire between us. Fingers brushing deliberately now, hands that lingered too long, breaths shared in close spaces. No more pretending it was harmless. And when it finally happened, it wasn't some romantic tryst under the stars. We found ourselves in the barn, both heavy with the weight of what was coming. The air smelled like hay and old wood. There was no turning back. When he kissed me, I didn't pull away this time. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Josh's face, felt his touch. The memory of our encounter in the barn played on repeat in my mind, a bittersweet mix of ecstasy and disgust. Rolling over, I stared at Howard's empty side of the bed. He was in the city again, probably working late at the office. I wondered if he even missed me anymore. The next morning, I went about my chores in a daze. My hands moved mechanically, feeding the chickens and weeding the garden, but my mind was elsewhere. When Josh showed up to help, my heart raced. We exchanged furtive glances, both of us knowing what had transpired between us. As we worked side by side in the fields, the air was thick with unspoken desire. Our hands brushed accidentally, sending shivers down my spine. I wanted nothing more than to throw myself into his arms, to feel alive again. But then Howard's face would flash in my mind, and the guilt would come crashing down. What kind of person was I, betraying the man I'd spent most of my life with? I tried to rationalize it. Howard had been distant for years, more interested in his work than in me. He'd left me alone, emotionally abandoned. Didn't I deserve some happiness? But even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. Two wrongs don't make a right, and my mother's voice echoed in my head, chiding me for my weakness. Still, when Josh's hand found mine behind the barn, I didn't pull away. When his lips met mine, I kissed him back with a hunger that scared me. For those brief moments, the guilt disappeared, drowned out by the thundering of my heart and the heat of his body against mine. It was only later, alone in my bed, that the shame would return. I'd stare at the ceiling, disgusted with myself, swearing that it would never happen again. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I knew that the next time Josh looked at me with those eyes full of desire, I'd give in again. I was trapped in a web of my own making, torn between the thrill of Josh's fingers and the cold reality of my betrayal. The weight of it sat heavy on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stood there, frozen in Josh's arms, our hearts pounding in sync as we heard the familiar crunch of gravel under tires. My blood ran cold. Howard wasn't supposed to be back for days. "Oh God," I whispered, panic rising in my throat. We scrambled to straighten our clothes, but it was too late. The barn door flew open with a bang that made me jump out of my skin. There he was, my husband of over 40 years, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly morphed into rage. "What the hell is this?" he roared, his voice shattering the stunned silence. Before I could even open my mouth, Howard lunged at Josh. His fist connected with a sickening thud, sending Josh sprawling to the ground. I screamed, but it was like I wasn't even there. Howard was on top of Josh in an instant. "You betrayed me, both of you." The words tore from Howard's throat, raw and primal. I'd never seen him like this, a stranger wearing my husband's face, consumed by fury. I tried to pull Howard off, but he shoved me away. All I could do was watch in horror. Josh tried to defend himself at first, but Howard's rage was unstoppable. Josh's face was unrecognizable, a swollen mess. I sobbed and begged Howard to stop. The full weight of what I'd done came crashing down. In my loneliness and selfishness, I'd shattered our lives beyond repair. The affair that had felt like an escape now felt like a noose around my neck. Finally, mercifully, Howard's energy began to wane. His fists slowed, his breathing ragged. Josh struggled to his feet, swaying unsteadily. With a word, he limped out of the barn, head bowed in shame. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, trembling, as Howard turned to face me. The look in his eyes made my blood run cold. There was no trace of the man I'd married, just icy detachment and disgust. Without a word, Howard walked out, leaving me alone in the wreckage of our lives. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. How had we come to this? That night, Howard locked himself in the guest bedroom. I knocked, I pleaded, I cried, but there was only silence. His rejection was worse than any shouting could have been. The cold fury radiating through that locked door told me everything I needed to know. Our marriage was over. In one moment of discovery, decades of love and trust had crumbled to dust. I lay awake all night, reliving the horror in the barn, seeing the betrayal in Howard's eyes over and over. What had I done? In my quest to feel alive again, I destroyed everything. Josh was gone, likely never to return. My husband, the steady presence I'd taken for granted all these years, now looked at me like I was less than nothing. As dawn broke, I realized with sickening clarity that there was no going back. The life I'd known was gone forever, shattered by my own selfishness. And I was alone with the consequences of my actions, adrift in a sea of regret with no shore in sight. I stared out the window, watching the sun rise over the farm I once loved. Now it felt like a prison, each acre a reminder of my betrayal. Howard's car was still in the driveway, but he might as well have been on another planet. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards as he moved around, always careful to avoid me. I tried to go about my day, but everything felt wrong. The coffee tasted bitter. The toast turned to ash in my mouth. I couldn't escape the weight of what I'd done. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Howard's face, the shock, the pain, the rage. And then that look, that cold, empty stare that told me everything was over. I gathered my courage and approached the guest room where Howard had locked himself away. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I say? How could I possibly explain? The words I'm sorry felt pathetically inadequate. Hours passed, and still Howard didn't emerge. When he finally did, it was like a ghost drifting through the house. He walked right past me in the kitchen, not even acknowledging my presence. I reached out, my fingers barely grazing his arm. "Howard, please." He recoiled as if my touch burned him, his eyes finally meeting mine. The disgust I saw there made me physically ill. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the shattered remains of our life together. Days blurred together. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was pointless. The farm work I'd once found satisfaction in now felt like a mockery. Every corner held a memory of Howard, of our life together, and now of Josh. The barn where it had all fallen apart loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of my shame. I caught glimpses of Howard as he moved through the house, always careful to keep his distance. He'd become a stranger to me, this man I'd spent decades loving. The cold fury radiating from him was palpable, filling every room with an icy chill that no amount of summer heat could dispel. One morning, I woke to find Howard's closet emptied, his clothes moved to the guest room. It was a silent declaration more final than any words could have been. Our marriage was over. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping for air. I tried to talk to him, to beg for forgiveness, to explain. But Howard's rejection was absolute. He looked right through me as if I didn't exist. When he did acknowledge me, it was with a look of such revulsion that I'd rather he ignored me entirely. The isolation was suffocating. I'd thought I knew loneliness before, but this was something else entirely. The silence in the house pressed in on me from all sides, broken only by my own ragged breathing and muffled sobs. I found myself wandering the property, lost in memories. Every tree, every fence post held the ghosts of happier times. I remembered the day we'd bought this land, full of dreams and hope for the future. Now those dreams lay shattered at my feet, ground to dust by my own actions. One afternoon, I saw Howard's car pull out of the driveway. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back. Not that I expected him to. As the dust settled behind his car, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe some time apart would help. Maybe he'd come back ready to talk, to try and move forward. But when Howard returned hours later, nothing had changed. If anything, the wall between us had grown higher. He walked past me carrying a stack of papers, his face a mask of cold indifference. I caught a glimpse of legal letterhead and my heart sank. He was planning for divorce, methodically dismantling our life together. That night, I lay awake in our bed, my bed now, I supposed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked and settled around me, sounds that had once been comforting now only serving to emphasize my solitude. I thought of Josh, wondering where he was, if he was okay after Howard's attack. But those thoughts only brought fresh waves of guilt and shame. Days passed in a haze of regret and self recrimination. I barely ate, barely slept. The farm work went undone, the garden overgrown. I couldn't bring myself to care. What did it matter now? Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd loved, was gone. Howard's presence in the house was like a physical weight, crushing me with silent accusations. Every time I saw him, every time he pointedly ignored me, it was a fresh reminder of what I'd done. The disgust in his eyes when he did look at me was unbearable. I found myself avoiding common areas of the house, retreating to my room or wandering the far reaches of the property just to escape that look. One evening, I mustered the courage to try again. I approached Howard as he sat at the kitchen table, poring over some documents. "Howard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "please, can we talk?" He didn't look up, didn't even pause in his reading. It was as if I hadn't spoken at all. I stood there, feeling foolish and small for what felt like hours before slinking away. The rejection stung worse than if he'd screamed at me. I began to lose track of time, days bled into weeks, marked only by the changing angle of sunlight through the windows. Howard and I continued our bizarre dance, two strangers sharing a space, but never truly occupying it at the same time. So the silence between us grew, a living thing with weight and substance. I tried to imagine a future, but my mind recoiled from the attempt. All I could see stretching before me was an endless expanse of this loneliness, this guilt, this crushing weight of regret. I had made my choice, and now I would have to live with the consequences. The farm, once my pride and joy, fell into disrepair around me. I couldn't bring myself to care. What was the point? Everything I'd loved about this place was tainted now. The orchard where Howard and I had shared our first kiss, the porch where we'd watched countless sunsets, all of it was poisoned by the memory of my betrayal. I found myself thinking of Josh more and more, not with longing or desire, but with a sick, twisting guilt. He was so young, so naive. I had taken advantage of that, let my own loneliness and desires override my better judgment. Now he was gone, driven away by violence and shame, and I was left alone with the wreckage of my choices. So one morning, I woke to find divorce papers on the kitchen table. Howard must have left them there before leaving for work. I stared at them for a long time, my heart breaking anew with each typed word. This was it then, the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I didn't sign them that day or the next. Some small, irrational part of me still clung to hope. But Howard's coldness never wavered, his disgust never lessened. Every day that passed made it clearer there was no coming back from this. So no forgiveness, no reconciliation, just the slow, agonizing death of everything we'd once shared. As summer faded into fall, I realized with a start that our anniversary had come and gone without acknowledgement. 40 years of marriage reduced to nothing more than a date on a calendar. I spent that night curled up in bed, sobbing until I had no tears left to shed. The isolation began to wear on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself talking to the empty rooms, carrying on one-sided conversations just to break the oppressive silence. Sometimes I'd catch myself laughing at nothing, a high, brittle sound that scared me more than the quiet had. I tried to lose myself in work, but even that was a reminder of what I'd lost. Every tool, every chore held memories of Howard, of the life we'd built together, of the future we'd planned. Now that future was gone, shattered by my own hands. As the leaves began to turn, I realized I couldn't go on like this. The farm was dying around me and I was dying with it. Something had to change. But when I looked to the future, all I could see was emptiness. I had made my choice, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And now I would spend the rest of my days alone, haunted by the ghosts of what might have been, knowing that I had no one to blame but myself.